Good morning, and welcome to a panel discussion we're calling Our Climate Vocation, Owning Our Calling. My name is Reverend Jim Antal, and I serve as the Special Advisor on Climate Justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. I'll be moderating today's discussion. Today, I'll be joined by three distinguished colleagues. William Barber III is the founder and CEO of the Rural Beacon Initiative, which seeks to advance community ownership in a new clean energy economy in frontline communities throughout the Southeast. Susan Varlamoff is a sustainability consultant for the Archdiocese of Atlanta, where she is implementing the Laudato Si action plan. Imam Saffet Abid Catovic is the head of the Office for Interfaith and Community Alliances of the Islamic Society of North America and chair of the Parliament of the World's Religions Climate Action Task Force. Over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, each of us is going to share how we have heard and responded to God's call to place climate action at the center of our vocation and to make it a core part of our ministry. We also hope to have some time at the end to respond to any questions that you might place in the chat. Let me begin by providing some context for our conversation. Throughout history, people of faith have shown that they have the power to bend the long arc of the moral universe toward justice by pushing society to make systemic change. For example, the abolition of slavery, the introduction of child labor laws, the civil rights and voting rights movement, the promotion of LGBTQ rights. All of these systemic changes were championed by religious voices and leaders. Each of these faithful individuals, including the dozens whose names we know and the millions whose names we've never heard of, each of them has regarded their involvement in that cause as their vocation, a calling from God to contribute their unique and distinctive gifts to a moral movement that would change society. Vocation, or calling, is often understood in only a personal way. The popular theologian Frederick Buechner defined vocation as the place where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet. But as it turns out, each of us has been given the gift of life at a time when life itself is in jeopardy. And because we have been called into life at this particular moment on the hinge of history, we must accept that the crisis we face places an inescapable moral claim on our generation and therefore on each one of us. It's up to us to urgently do what needs to be done using the unique gifts each of us brings. Let me put it in another way. Like young people who matured in the early 1940s, we don't get to do what we want to do. We have to do what needs to be done. By responding as they did, those young people became the greatest generation. That understanding of calling is now ours. It's up to us, every person, every day, to embrace the fact that climate action is the vocation of our generation. The question every person of faith and every faith community must ask is, will we accept our calling? Will we respond to our vocation? And how? Now let's turn to our panelists, beginning with William Barber III. William, you're such a gifted person. Briefly tell us how you came to embrace working for environmental justice as the core of your vocation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Let me first say greetings to everyone who's joining us, and so glad to be on with you, my esteemed co-panelists. When you talk about this notion of vocation and how we got to this work, I want to echo some of what was alluded to in terms of the urgency of now that Dr. King reminded us of, the inescapable web of mutuality that he also reminded us of. And we really, as a generation, those of us who find ourselves alive in this moment, find ourselves at the intersection of those two concepts. When we talk about the climate crisis, a crisis that is unprecedented, that threatens to make worse every social inequity that we as a society have unfortunately perfected. And I say perfected because these have been intentional decisions over the years. There's a crisis. When we talk about the millions of people who threaten to be displaced, who threaten to have livelihoods uprooted, there's an urgency of now. So we all find ourselves in this moment where there is urgent action, and there is unfortunately, a reality that we can be too late. And we also talk about the inescapable web of mutuality that makes us understand that the impact that we see at the hyperlocal, at the individual level, is just a small piece of what we all would experience. And so, that has been a foundational concept for me in coming to this work. I'm a son of Eastern North Carolina, a son of the South, and I grew up in areas that we would identify as impacted areas right now. But I also grew up seeing the incredible amount of genius, of love, of self-determination that existed in these areas that show that these were powerhouses of opportunity. And as I deepen my career, I have a background in environmental physics, background in environmental law and energy policy, and then about a decade of grassroots organizing experience, I began to connect these dots that when we started to really understand this global climate crisis that we were experiencing, it threatened to impact the communities that I grew up in, my family, my friends, the people that I cared about first and worst. And then as I started to dive deeper and understand the history, how this wasn't just happenstance, how legacies of pollution and injustice have made these communities more vulnerable, I had to understand that this was a part of my calling, my vocation, to really step in and help mitigate and come up with solutions. I'll tell you a quick story as we're short on time. When I was in my undergrad year, I was doing an exercise where I was wrestling with what the future trajectory of my service would look like. And I had at that same time the opportunity to attend what became known as the North Carolina Poverty Tour. That poverty tour was done by the North Carolina NAACP and the UNC Center for Poverty in response to one of our state legislators going on record and saying he did not believe in 2012 that extreme poverty existed in the state of North Carolina. So just casually dismissing a couple million people in the state. These two entities came together and said, we're not going to allow you to say this untruth without being challenged. So we're going to go to some of the most egregious areas of poverty across our state, interview people and tell their stories so that we're faced with the realities. One of the locations that we visited was a small town called Navassa, North Carolina. If you're familiar with Navassa, it's on the eastern part of the state. It's a beautiful area. I'm a country boy. It pulls at my heartstrings. The Cape Fear River comes through, serves as a natural deep sea port, beautiful, undeveloped area. The community cannot develop, however, because a wood processing plant came in and poisoned over 600 acres of land in the heart of this community. Say all that to say, that's the impact that we're seeing on the ground. But more importantly, we heard from a woman, and I'll wrap up here, who lost 13 out of 15 of her siblings to the chemicals, the carcinogens that were placed in the ground. The company had not been held accountable. The community was locked into a situation of disinvestment. But more importantly, it put me on a trajectory to understand that when we talk about this environmental and climate crisis, these are real lives. These are real impacts. These are real people that for generations have been hurt by our bad policy decisions. And so knowing that we have the skills, the networks, the opportunities to address that, to do our small piece, became a major part of our work.
William, thank you for your witness. And Susan, like William, there's so many interests you could have pursued. Briefly tell us how engaging your diocese to care for our common home became your vocation.
Certainly, but I just wanted to say something to William. I've also worked in environmental justice, and it's extraordinary the hardships these corporations have put on the people that living nearby. And I was involved with that myself, and I will discuss this. So a confluence of factors encouraged me to work with the Catholic Church on climate change at this point in my life. And when I heard that Pope Francis was about to come out with an encyclical, environmental encyclical in 2015, I was thrilled. And I thought, this is my moment. And I jumped at this opportunity to see if I could help in some way. I am Catholic. I am a biologist. I felt my education, my work experience, and my temperament all would contribute to this work. I was finishing up my career at the University of Georgia, so I thought, well, I'll have the time. Just by way of my background, I'm a biologist, a mother, a grandmother, engaged my whole life in working to protect the environment. My first job, this is crazy, in the 1970s at Columbia University, I worked on a climate change grant just out of university. I then went on to work as an environmental activist, William, in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, where a garbage company decided to expand their toxic landfill 2 blocks from our home. 8.5 years later, 3 series of leadership, we were able to shut it in a precedent-setting case. I then went on to Georgia, and I received a master's degree, worked as a pollution prevention specialist, and then went on to work at the University of Georgia, where I recently retired. I am a writer, I'm a lecturer. So I thought, if I could put this all together with all my contacts, maybe I could help Pope Francis. I approached the Archdiocese of Atlanta Archbishop and said, do you think I could work with the Pope on this upcoming encyclical? And he laughed and he said, listen, Susan, he said, this is an inside job. They do this at the Vatican, but we need an action plan for Georgia. So to implement his encyclical. So I called my good friend, Dr. Rob McDowell. He's a geologist. And he said, sure, I'm in. We called our other colleagues at the University of Georgia of various faiths and disciplines. And I was shocked that they were so enthusiastic about working on this project. And then I realized, Pope Francis is a chemist. People don't know that. So he understands the science. And so, but he's the moral leader of 1.3 billion Catholics on earth. And people follow him. There's even a study by Yale Communications that the Pope Francis effect before and after his encyclical came out, Laudato Si, people increased their understanding and belief in climate change. So I had no idea what I was about to engage in. So we produced this action plan with various actions, easy, medium, advanced, and we submitted it, and it came to be used now. It's being used throughout the country as a template for other archdioceses. We updated it. I have a copy here. Can you see it? No. Yeah. It's in 2 languages. And the Vatican is now using it for their Laudato Si action platform. So all this to say is that I'm glad I decided to do this. And the focus of the update is a lot on environmental justice too, that we're asking people in their archdiocese to see how they can serve in these issues. And we have plenty, William, in Georgia, to see how they can serve these minority communities. But so that's pretty much my story. And I'm, again, blown over with the impact we've had.
Susan, thank you so much. And, when we think about the fact that there are, 200 dioceses across the country, I know what an example your work is now for other dioceses who are beginning to engage the issue of climate justice. So, Imam Saffet, what are your thoughts? As a clergy leader and also as an academic, you could have gone in so many different directions. Tell us how you came to understand addressing the climate emergency is your vocation.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Wonderful to be with you all. Excuse me. Amazing stories and amazing experiences. Thank you so much, Brother William, and our dear sister, for sharing an incredible journey that you've gone through, and appreciate being with you, Jim, and with our audience. For me, the journey towards vocation for environmental activism, to ensure that our lives are a mercy for the earth, which is one of the slogans of the Green Faith program and the Green Faith movement, which I am also a part of, and which I got some of my religious environmental training at, is something that didn't come in a moment. It was sort of a progression. And so when I sort of look back and I think about things, I think about the experiences over the years with my religious teachers, who pointed me towards various types of understandings of the role and function of human beings on the earth, and the charge which we have been given by God. In the Quranic telling of the story of the creation of Adam, after God creates Adam and infuses his spirit into Adam and giving him life, and creates Hawa, his partner, Eve, together, God asked the angels to bow down out of respect and honor for this new creation. And the angels are somewhat puzzled, and they say, why should we bow down before someone having some knowledge of what might happen, who will cause bloodshed in the earth and who will disrupt the balance? We are your functionaries, in a sense. We're already doing the jobs of praising you and glorifying you and carrying out the various functions of keeping the universe and the world running. And now you're going to put this new creature in that's going to, we feel, disrupt things. And God says, I know that which you don't know. And I think that that's been sort of a driving force of my understanding and my vocation. Adam was appointed as a khulafa al-ard. All human beings take that responsibility, guardians, caretakers, to be good stewards of the earth. We were entrusted with a heavy and awesome responsibility. And so over the years, my religious teachers have sort of brought to light various of Islam's teachings with regard to honoring this amana, this trust, fulfilling the requirements of the trust by the trust giver, who is God, and with regard to caretaking for the earth. And so I sort of say theologically, I sort of was grown in that realm. And it's very important, theologically speaking, that I understood the idea of balance, that we have to be in balance with ourselves. We have to be in balance with the natural world. We have to have the cosmic order and the balance that is in the cosmos come down and be effectuated in the world through our work. Practically speaking, I sort of understood my connection to the earth, and thank you for that inextricable mutuality that our brother William has pointed us towards from the words of our beloved late Martin Luther King Jr. And that is the idea that we are linked and connected together. And this I learned from the idea of being a farmer growing up in Teaneck, New Jersey, in the backyard of our home. My father brought this tradition, also being a biologist by his training and a religious teacher and Imam by his upbringing, the idea of planting with one's hands and growing from the earth by doing work on it in a positive and constructive way. And then seeing the coming forth of life and new life from the earth as a result of that action, and tasting things that were so delicious with the absence of any sort of chemical fertilizers and various types of chemical inputs. And the reminders during that process that we need to take care, we need to nurture, we need to sort of weed, we need to be patient. And we need to return those parts of the fruits and the vegetables which we had grown with our hands back to the earth, which we didn't consume. So the idea of composting and returning back to the earth that which belongs to the earth and comes from the earth. And the idea that within the Muslim tradition, we would often break during this time of farming and in the backyard and sort of go into prayer. And our prayer for Muslims has to do with the idea that wherever we are, we just turn our faces the direction of the east. The entire earth, the Prophet Muhammad has been made a place of prayer, and so it's been made sacred. So practically speaking, we would engage in prayer. And I often would reflect, had I not placed my head upon an earth that was pure and purifying, but instead that was polluted, as was mentioned before, as a result of the tours and the visits and the work that our brother William and our sister Susan are doing, that what type of place would I be praying on? How would I be connecting to God in this deep personal way, mediated through the poisons that have been placed within the earth? Fortunately, in our backyard, we didn't use fertilizers, but in other areas, the dumping of toxic waste, et cetera, have brought that about. I learned from my father the idea from his ancestral home in Bosnia and Herzegovina of the sacredness of the earth, and that the earth has bared witness to what people have done. And one of the things that I always carry around with me is this rock. This is a small rock from the many rocks that dot the hillsides of my father's home in Herzegovina, in Bosnia and Herzegovina in Europe, that witnessed genocide and people's blood being shed because they were different than others. But that earth has sort of reclaimed that space and that place of sacredness, and this idea that the earth today that's being poisoned by the chemicals and by the companies and by the petroleum industry and so on and so forth. And we who are complicit in that through our consumption behaviors and patterns have a responsibility to stop the killing, stop the murder of the future. Millions and millions of species ceasing to exist, no longer being able to bear witness to God's glory, nor being able to be functional parts of the ecosystem, which makes it wholesome and which makes it healthy for all the creatures that it supports. So I think there's a lot of challenges that come about. I'm reminded when I think about the rock, and I'll conclude here, about the idea of being connected to the mountains, and the idea that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on one occasion stood before one of the great mountains outside of Medina, and he said, "This mountain of Uhud loves us, hub, and we love her." This idea of connection to the earth as something that is more than the sum total of her utilitarian value for our consumption purposes and our lifestyle practices, that it's much more than that. And the need for us, climate emergency, you mentioned, to address the climate emergency. When we were growing up, there was no alarm bells ringing. It was not a climate emergency, but it definitely has become one. And what legacy we will leave to the generations that come after us. I'm always reminded, and I'll conclude here, of the statements of our indigenous peoples that said, whenever you take an action or think or contemplate about taking an action, you must consider 7 generations from now how that action will impact them. Think about that, and we need to think about that in our planning, in our organizing, in our mobilizing, and in the work that needs to be done. Lastly, I think that our religious traditions, and I find this more as I dig deeper into the teachings of Islam, but in conversation with our other faith partners. Laudato Si was mentioned. The Islamic Climate Declaration followed suit from Laudato Si. So we were very appreciative of this interfaith dialogue at a grand scale, because that which we stand for, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, animists, and peoples of no faiths and any faiths, is what we stand upon. I think that's attributed to William Barry. So that which we stand for is what we stand upon, and we stand upon the earth, an earth which we share together and which we're entrusted to care for. So I became charged over time and through my activism and work with other faith traditions in beginning to explore ways in which Muslims can begin to green their practices based upon their religious teachings, and to find ways in which we can move forward. And lastly, I'd just like to say, as clergy folk and as peoples of faith, we have a unique position because, in a sense, we are salespeople and marketers of something that costs. What do I mean by that? We, as part of our traditions, have what's known as an ethic of restraint and conservation. We tell people to hold off for something that comes better, to not do everything that you want to do at the expense of everyone else, but rather be patient, to hold off, to not consume as much, not to waste, to conserve. There is a glory that is coming that is greater than the glory which we can experience here and now. So let us hold off. Let us restrain ourselves. Let us reduce our impacts upon the earth. Let us walk softly on the earth. Thank you. God bless.
Imam, thank you so much for those moving comments and for telling us a little bit about how you came to this understanding and to your vocation. You also, in the last part of your comments, anticipated a question that I now want to put to William and Susan, and that is, what advice would you give to someone who is beginning to discern a call to leverage more of their talents or their strengths or their knowledge or their authority or their networks to accelerate a bold climate action? William, could you give us a brief answer to that question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Jim, for that question. I think the first thing we have to recognize is that when we talk about this climate and environmental crisis, one thing we have to do is put it in context. This is of an unprecedented scale of such that no singular sector of expertise or of our society can solve it on its own. Private finance can't solve it on its own. Science cannot solve it on its own. Faith community cannot solve it on its own. Community organizing cannot solve it on its own. Philanthropy cannot solve it on its own. Grassroots organizing cannot solve it on its own. That is literally where we are. And so in that, it may seem daunting, but I think it actually offers an opportunity for us to operate out of a sense of urgency, but also humility, to recognize we do have to build across sectors, to have to understand that we need expertise from many different sources, and that we have to come together and build a new politic to actually meet this moment of urgency in which we find ourselves. Number two, and relatedly, is a lot of times when we think of the climate and environmental crisis, we have segregated it from the human compellings that are offered some of our most urgent compellings and most urgent sources of inspiration to actually act in this moment of crisis. A lot of times we think of the climate crisis as a technical or scientific issue, and I appreciate that, having a background in the law and the science myself, but we also must recognize this is a human issue. This is very deeply a human issue. And as a person of faith, as a Christian, to piggyback off of what some of the Imam said, I think that we get some of our most powerful and most urgent compellings in this moment from our faith traditions. As a Christian, we see it in Genesis 1:26-28, where God grants this role of stewardship over creation. And there's been a misinterpretation there oftentimes in that passage where people read in dominion, but it's really not one of dominion over the earth. It's one of stewardship, of caretaking, of being a protector. We see it in Numbers, 35, where it says, "You shall not pollute the land in the midst of where God dwells." We see it in holy Hindu teachings that articulate that the 5 great elements create this web of life that is shown forth in the structure and interconnectedness of the cosmos and the human body. And we see it in Islam, in the Quran, where it says, "Do not commit abuse on the earth, spreading corruption." And so say all that to say that second piece is that we must understand that this crisis is a crisis of policy, a crisis of technology, a crisis of science, but it is also a human crisis. And then third, and finally, I would say that when we're thinking about the most impacted, the communities that are being hit first and worse by the current physical manifestations of this crisis. I live in the southeastern United States, which is actually leading the way. It houses the highest concentration of global carbon pollutants, houses the highest concentration of persistent poverty communities, houses the greatest concentration of communities of color, and houses the areas that are seeing the most numerous billion-dollar weather disasters made worse by climate change. So that provides this real hotspot area of impact in our national discourse when we're talking about this environmental crisis. That leads to the third point of when we are thinking about those impacted areas, when we are thinking about climate action that puts forth climate and environmental justice, we must recognize that we do not need to lead with charity or paternalism. We don't need to act on behalf of communities who are impacted. We must act in partnership, in brotherhood, in solidarity with communities, because there exists in these areas an incredible amount of genius, ingenuity, self-determination that we have to tap into and amplify in our larger movement if we are going to act with authority and efficiency. And in doing that, we really have an opportunity to build a movement that understands this urgent moment, that is responsive to it, that takes into account the holistic nature of our expertise, and that leads in a way that we can truly say we can transition our economies and our society in a just way to a clean, equitable economy for everyone.
William, thank you. If we could just get our generation to wake up to the gifts and the knowledge we already have, and then turn it on to the issue of environmental justice. I so appreciate it. Susan, what's your advice for how somebody who might be just beginning to discern a call could leverage their gifts in this direction?
I would say build on your strengths. Impacting climate change is going to require everyone, people with all different, in all different walks of life. We need scientists, we need engineers, we need videographers, we need moms and dads, we need educators. And so I was going to give an example of what we're encouraging people to do in the Catholic faith is to set up creation care teams. So the priest would get up on the altar and say, this is what we're doing. And actually, it was me who got on the altar. And who would like to work on climate change? And what I was shocked to see was 45 people signed up. And, with all kinds of skills. So here's who I have on my climate change team. We've got an engineer who set up the program for the Archdiocese. But we've got somebody who works for Organic Valley and says, hey, we need to have local food, in our different menus here, because, at church, they've always got potlucks. And so why not take food from the local farmers, and it's interesting too, the ideas that people come up with. One woman came and she said, I'm sick of the trash after all these big events. We've got to do something. So she said, let's wash dishes. And she's got skills she's a mother and grandmother. So we started washing dishes, so another is a videographer. She videotapes all of our workshops and events so, people can see them later. Another is an agricultural extension agent. He trains us in how to grow food in our backyards. And he also is helping us grow food for the food pantry at the church. So we've got a food pantry. And we've got people working there. Someone else is Hispanic. She translates all of our work into Spanish and engages the Hispanic community. So there's so many ways people can contribute. And I say, do what you can with your skills and the time that you have. But everybody can contribute something.
Susan, thank you so much, especially for those concrete examples, which are present in every congregation, actually. So we only have, looks like about 6 minutes left, and I want to go to the third question. And Imam Saffet, I'd like you to address it first, if you would. And that is, if you could share briefly your understanding of hope and the role it plays in addressing the climate emergency.
Thank you for that. There's a tradition that says as the end of time comes within the Muslim tradition. I think there's also a Talmudic text within the Jewish tradition regarding a similar story. And the world is going to hell in a handbag, excuse my phraseology. And you see it, you see the whirlwinds coming and the destruction happening as the end of times is upon us. And the question is, what should you do? And the Prophet Muhammad said, take the sapling that's in your hand and with your family and with those around you, plant it in the ground. And the commentators on this tradition say it may be that it was a useless action. It was an action which is going to really no benefit because the end of times it's there. But in which case you will receive the blessings of that act. For anyone who partakes of something that someone planted, human or non-human, any benefit from it, eating, shade, breathing the air, etc. All of that serves as a charity for the ones who planted it. But they said it may be that God might push back Judgment Day a little bit longer so that tree may grow and that it may fulfill all those blessings to others. You mentioned, Reverend Jim, about the Great Generation. One of the stories that my mom used to tell me was that they were encouraged during World War II when the world confronted the force of fascism and white supremacy, as we are forced to confront them again these days with the petro dictators and all this other stuff, that they were told by the government of the United States, help our troops who are in the front lines of this fight because they don't have enough provision by planting gardens. They became known as victory gardens. 20 million Americans on their rooftops, in their backyards, in their open plains, planted those victory gardens. Each one is one of those saplings. And I think in the face of what we're struggling against, we need to adopt that type of attitude. So that's my hope. We have something in our hands. Let's put it in the ground and let's make this world a better place.
Those are just such wonderful examples. And if I might add, Imam, they will preach. William, would you share with us your understanding of the role hope plays for you?
Absolutely. I think, hope is incredibly important, in compelling us to action in this moment. When I talk about the faith traditions really, being one of the most powerful sources of inspiration in this moment, I think it is because of that message of hope across faith sectors that we see. I also think that hope is really not optional. I mean, what is the alternative in this moment? And I don't say that lightly. I don't think there's a middle ground for the urgency of now where we find ourselves. It's either hope and action or despair and inaction and ignoring it. And, it almost is reminiscent of the poem by T.S. Eliot, where he talked about the hollow men and just said that, really, this is the way the world ends, kind of with a whisper, with us just kind of seating and not doing anything. And we don't have that luxury. We do not have that luxury. But in terms of what inspires me personally to this moment, I think there are some real concrete examples, that I would encourage others to take a look at. I'm deeply encouraged by the activism of emerging movements, where we see young people especially coming together in an intergenerational, interracial way, understanding the intersectionalities of these issues and demanding that we prioritize action. Significant action, not just rhetoric, but direct action, demanding that we prioritize the voices of the ones most impacted amongst us. I'm incredibly inspired by their courage, their leadership, and their dedication. I'm also inspired, by the fact when we see people, humans, imperfect as we are, coming together and starting to understand these mutual threads, understand our connections to one another, and recognizing that in this moment, imperfectly, stumbling, clawing, fighting, in all of the ways that make us beautifully human, we can make progress on this issue. But at the end of the day, it takes us all to understand we have a part to play, we have a role to play, and we must act and act urgently.
William, thank you so much. Susan, how about you? What gives you hope?
Hope I learned when I worked in Eden Prairie as an activist at a very young age. It took us 8.5 years to shut the landfill, prevent the company from expanding. It was a precedent-setting case. I was so discouraged at times, but I kept moving. Hope pushes me forward with the Catholic Church. There's 1.3 billion of us. We've got a fabulous leader. The Vatican is using the work, has nominated Atlanta, Georgia, as the model for the country. They set up a global platform. It sounds awfully familiar, like what we did. And what we did, I want to say, can be used by any faith. All faiths have sacred scriptures. So I hold out hope that if you persist long enough, you keep gathering momentum, we will overcome this. We'll see that carbon dioxide curve come down, and I pray and I work like crazy. I'm hopeful.
Well, my addition to what all you have said is to quote Greta Thunberg, who says, hope starts with honesty. And it applies in just about every situation I can think of. And it's just another way, in addition to what you said, William, of how young people are teaching us a way forward. I want to thank all three of you, William, Susan, and Imam Saffet. Thank you so much for your work, your witness, and for all the ways that you are responding to God's call. Carol, back to you.